Hi, it's Mr. Ramage, and today's lesson is going to focus on pre-World War II events involving the United States and American isolationism in the decade leading up to World War II. This is from Unit 5, and the state standard for this particular lesson is: during the 1930s, the U.S. government attempted to distance the country from earlier interventionist policies in the Western Hemisphere, as well as retain an isolationist approach to events in Europe and Asia until the beginning of World War II. So in this lesson, we're going to focus on what policies and steps did the United States take leading up to 1941 in order to avoid getting involved in conflicts either in Europe or in Asia. So we just finished Unit 4, which was about the Great Depression, and as events are transpiring in Europe and Asia, bringing the world to another world war, America is still in the Great Depression. Americans are still unemployed, seeking work, and the economy just hasn't recovered despite all of the work that had been done under President Roosevelt's New Deal program. Isolationist policies had not been something new, though. America was moving more towards an isolationist point of view after the events of World War I. With the failure of the Treaty of Versailles and the failed ratification of the League of Nations, America distanced itself from getting involved in events in other parts of the world. A number of different treaties and pacts had made sure that the United States was trying its best to not be a world leader, but to take some actions that would remove itself from getting involved in conflicts, potentially leading to war. So as news is coming across from Europe and from Asia, and we see and hear things that are happening in places like Germany and Japan, Korea and China, and the Soviet Union, Americans are not really concerned about these issues because they're more focused on what's happening at home. Americans are still out of work, the economy is still in a depression, and we can't really be concerned with the issues of others right now. So what is happening in other parts of the world? We do kind of need to know a little bit about the start of World War II in order to understand the events that are going to eventually bring America into this war. So real quick, we have the rise of powerful dictators in Europe, starting in 1922 with the rise of Benito Mussolini and the Fascist Party in Italy. In 1926, Joseph Stalin finds himself the head of the Soviet Union and the leader of the Communist Party in that country. And probably the one everybody knows is Adolf Hitler in 1933 becomes Chancellor of Germany. Now, under the leadership of these three dictators, people within their country are going to suffer greatly, but also a large portion of the population will follow in line with these three leaders, and they will play a prominent role in bringing Europe to the brink of war by 1939. Besides Europe, Japan over in Asia is also going through a very similar period of transformation into a very militaristic regime. The current emperor of Japan is Emperor Hirohito, and although he's the emperor, the real power lies with the Japanese military. Japanese militarists are looking to expand Japan's power, and in the early 1930s they invade Korea as well as Manchuria and have their sights set on an invasion of China, which they will eventually do. So we're seeing the growth of powerful, militaristic, fascist dictatorships in both Asia and in Europe. Now, at the end of World War I, you remember that there was the League of Nations, which was created to prevent future wars from happening. So out of the ashes of World War I comes the idea from President Woodrow Wilson of a League of Nations. Well, the League of Nations is going to ultimately fail. We've hinted at this previously. Without the United States joining, the League of Nations does not really have enough force to enforce its sanctions and regulations, and nations like Japan and Germany will just simply drop out of the League of Nations and will not abide by their guidance and guidelines. So the League of Nations, which was supposed to prevent a future war, fails miserably. So real quick, World War II begins in 1939. We're not going to go into all the details of it, but looking at the map here in On your screen, we have Nazi Germany with its alliance of Italy, basically securing most of Western Europe. The Soviet Union had made a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany and decided to avoid conflict with each other for now, dividing the lands east of Germany, especially Poland, in half. Eventually, Hitler will turn on the Soviet Union, but for right now, in 1940, basically it's Great Britain that stands alone against Hitler and Mussolini, while the United States across the Atlantic remains neutral and isolated. England will have to fight off and survive Germany for now and hope that the United States will eventually join the war. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at American neutrality. So as events are transpiring in Europe throughout the 1930s, the United States is going to pass some neutrality laws to make sure that the country remains neutral through all of these events that are taking place in Europe and leading down sort of that inevitable road to World War. The first is going to be the Neutrality Act of 1935, and that basically states that it is illegal for America to sell arms to countries at war. If you recall, with World War I, one of the big issues was America trying to engage in trade with belligerent nations, with nations at war. So we want to make sure that we get ahead of the game this time and make it illegal for American business to do that. We're going to follow that up with the Neutrality Act of 1936, which also banned loans to countries at war. It expanded the illegality of selling arms to other countries at war, and it's also going to add an additional punishment for loaning money to countries at war. So it makes it illegal for American banks and other financial institutions and or the government itself to loan money to nations at war. The Neutrality Act of 1939, though, does begin to change things a little bit. It will allow for the sale of arms to nations at war, but on a cash and carry basis, meaning that if, for instance, England wanted to purchase war materials from us, then they would have to come here and buy them and transport them back on their own ships. Again, if you go back to World War I, we had American ships being sunk by German submarines, Americans dying on the seas in trying to do business with these nations at war. Again, we want to avoid all of those issues that brought us into World War I, so the Neutrality Act of 1939 does say that we can sell arms to nations at war, but they must pay for them in cash and they must come and get them themselves, thereby keeping Americans out of harm's way. And then eventually in 1941, this is about 2 years after the war has already been going on, we have what's called the Lend-Lease Act. This is going to allow the United States to lend or to lease arms to any nation whose defense is vital, right? So, quote, vital to the defense of the United States is the language from the Lend-Lease Act. This is basically specifically targeting countries who are at war with members of the Axis power. That's Germany, Italy, and eventually Japan. So in the defense of the United States, we want to make sure that we're protected, and we're going to arm and provide aid to those countries whose survival impacts our safety and defense. This will mostly involve England and China. So the Lend-Lease Act is we're going to loan materials of war to countries in need. So you can see a change here in the Neutrality Act between 1935 and 1941. Before the war, the acts are pretty clear. They're not really negotiable. 1939, as the war begins, we have a little bit more flexibility in our neutrality. And then by 1941, we're essentially providing aid to countries who are fighting against the Axis powers. One of the other topics that the OST likes to ask about is the Atlantic Charter. And this was a meeting between President Franklin Delano Roosevelt of the United States and the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. And this takes place out in the Atlantic Ocean. And this is a pretty important meeting. The first time that these two leaders had met face to face. And England is extraordinarily desperate for aid to their cause against Germany. So at the Atlantic Charter meeting on board this ship, England and the United States basically agree to the following terms. And this sounds very familiar going back to President Wilson's 14 points. And essentially, they're negotiating what would happen after the war is over. Again, the United States is not committing to going to war just yet, but the Atlantic Charter kind of tells us what we would be doing once the war is over. It's a chance to sort of set our terms, if you will. So there are about 8 points to the Atlantic Charter. These are kind of a brief summary. And again, they sound quite familiar if you think back to Wilson's 14 points. After the war is over, each nation will not seek to gain any lands or territories once the war is over. That was a big issue with the Treaty of Versailles, as England and France and Italy and other countries were sort of jockeying to get lands and territories to enrich themselves. We're not going to do that at the end of this war. We're going to go back to this idea of self-determination, that the right of nations around the world, they should have the ability to choose their own government and to be free of any kind of colonial control. We want to make sure that we have free trade between nations, freedom of the seas, and we should disarm after the war is over. That's something that's not really going to happen. But these are the basic ideas of the Atlantic Charter, and England and the United States agree to those. And eventually about 22 other countries will come on board with this Atlantic Charter, forming the basis of what will eventually become the United Nations during and after World War II. So the Atlantic Charter is significant in terms of American isolationism because it does show that the United States is going to provide a lot of support for these nations at war, but ultimately, the United States is still not in this war. We avoid declaring war or committing to joining the war. We're simply identifying what we would like to see once the war is over. So the Atlantic Charter, again, America is not joining the war. But events are going to start to transpire, especially in Asia, that are going to bring the United States into World War II. And the Japanese are becoming more and more aggressive as the 1930s goes on. Japan is a relatively resource-poor country. It's a small island nation and needs to gain access to resources in other parts of the world, specifically in mainland Asia. So in the early 1930s, Japan is going to invade Korea and Manchuria, and then eventually it's going to invade China. So the United States is expanding its empire. Now this is going to bring us into conflict with Japan. The United States, remember, has control of the Philippine Islands, which is just southwest of the islands of Japan. Also, the British have a number of different colonies in Southeast Asia, so Japanese expansion is a threat to our interests. So as Japan begins to become more and more aggressive, President Roosevelt places economic sanctions and restrictions on Japan. Basically, the United States is not going to sell them iron, steel, or oil. Well, if you're a resource-poor country and you are funding a huge military expansion and a huge military operation, you absolutely need iron, steel, and oil. So the Japanese are very angry with the United States. Out of that anger, Japan turns to Italy and Germany and Italy reach out to Japan and ask them to join the Axis powers. Germany ultimately wants Japan to help them against the Soviet Union, which is just to the north of China. So, as an ally, Japan could be very helpful in a war against the Soviet Union. Now, as we get further on into the 1930s and as Japan invades China, President Roosevelt will begin to support China through the Lend-Lease Act, which again angers the Japanese. Here's the United States providing weapons and war materials to China to support them in a war against the Japanese. So again, Japan's not happy with the United States. In July of 1941, Japan continues its expansion by moving south and invading Indochina. This would be like the area of Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. Again, this is a closer encroachment to the Philippines and to other British territories in Southeast Asia. So Japan invading Indochina threatens the British and American territories and causes President Roosevelt to take another aggressive action towards the Japanese by freezing all Japanese assets in the United States. So any money that the Japanese have in America essentially is frozen and they can't access it and touch it. While all this is happening, the Japanese see this inevitable conflict with the United States and begin to plan an attack on our U.S. Navy, which is based in Hawaii, on the island of Oahu at Pearl Harbor. So Japan begins to plan a surprise sneak attack against the United States with the overall objective of taking out our Pacific fleet. So, on December 7th, 1941, a Sunday morning, Japanese planes launched from aircraft carriers a couple of hundred miles off the coast of Hawaii do indeed carry out a sneak attack on our U.S. base located there. We're not going to go into a lot of details for the attack, but the plan was essentially for the Japanese to cripple America's Pacific fleet. They targeted our fuel reserves, our ships, our aircraft carriers, our aircraft, our radar and communication stations. They didn't get all of them, and yes, the attack was very devastating. About 3,000 people were killed, a number of ships were sunk and destroyed, and yes, they did a lot of damage, but ultimately it could have been significantly worse. And essentially, in the long run, the attack is going to fail because this will bring the United States into the war on the side of the Allies and essentially signal the end of this Japanese expansion. Now, that's not to say there's not going to be a lot of really intense and really brutal, terrible fighting with the Japanese for the next 4 years. There will be, but basically their failure to take out and minimize our ability to attack them in return leads to their ultimate defeat. The plan, again, was to take out our ships so that we would have to rebuild for a significantly long period of time. During that rebuilding process, Japan would continue to expand into Southeast Asia, and that would make us retaliating very, very difficult to do. And we would probably just sort of negotiate some sort of peace agreement. But that's not going to happen. So the next day, December the 8th, 1941, President Roosevelt goes before a joint session of Congress and asks for a declaration of war against Japan, which he will receive, thereby ending essentially American isolationism. 3 days later, on December the 11th, 1941, Germany and Italy, as allies with Japan, are going to declare war on the United States. And this is going to bring the United States into World War II and fight a two-front war. So we will be going to war with Germany and Italy in Europe, which will be the European theater of the war, and then also against Japan in the Pacific theater of the war. So America's isolationism is over in 1941, and America joins the war fighting against Germany, Italy, and Japan. So to wrap things up on the first part of our look at Unit 2, again, we're focusing on American isolationism. So a lot of the questions that you might see in terms of the OST is dealing with the things that are here on the screen, looking at and understanding American neutrality before the war and some of the specific actions that we took. So make sure you're familiar with the Neutrality Acts of 1935, 36, 39, and especially the Lend-Lease Act of 1941, as well as the Atlantic Charter, which again agrees to terms post-World War II and shows American support for the war, but ultimately America not joining the war itself. That is until the Japanese attack in 1941. So hopefully this helps you understand this standard and will be able to answer any questions that you see coming up on that awesome graduation test.